So today's topics are language variation, which is sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is the area of the study of language and society. We do not speak in a vacuum. We speak in a situation within our societies, within our speech communities, and that is important to take into consideration when we think about language. When we did the pragmatics files, we talked about how language is to an extent defined by the speech situation, but a language is also defined to an extent by sociolinguistic social constructs. Where a person comes from geographically and socially, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about language variation is a cover term for a lot of things. In its most general coverage, it refers to the fact that we have different languages in the world. We have Spanish, we have English, we have Chinese, we have my first language, which is Finnish, and we tend to realize right away that, hey, this person is speaking a different language from what is my language. So that's the most general kind of, or most robust, or most salient kind of language variation, that we have different languages in the world. Numbers that people, linguists give about how many languages there are in the world, they vary from, sometimes from 5,000 to 7,000, but that's the rough idea of how many languages there are in the world. There are a lot of languages, and there are languages that are dying as we speak here. So there are a lot of smaller languages that are unlikely to survive. You may have also heard about efforts by societies and politicians and linguists and community organizers of surviving languages, of maintaining languages so that they would not die. Because when the last speaker of a language dies, that's when that language dies also. So very often the languages also that are endangered, they don't necessarily have a written grammar or written records, and then there's nothing left. So it's just like, an extinction of an endangered species, an endangered plant, or what have you. It's the same thing. So when a language dies, together with that language, a lot of the knowledge of the world kind of dies as well, because languages are windows to cultures, and it's always a sad thing. So that's the most general kind of language variation. Of course, our language, English, is a power language in the world, and even though there are not, English is not the language that has the most native speakers, Chinese would be that language, but it is the most spoken, most often studied language as a foreign language in the world. So it has gotten that kind of a status as a power language of the world, not just haphazardly. People didn't just decide, okay, let's make English the power language of the world, the language of the international communication, international business, international conferences, and so on. It happened because of the power of the speakers of English. It was first the British Commonwealth that went to a lot of places in the world, and then that has changed during the recent decades. American English has gotten to be the language because of the influence of America in the USA in the world. So it's those kinds of considerations. Languages are connected to their speakers, and if their speakers have prestige, then that language will have prestige. So it's not a coincidence that English is studied all over the world. And so that's the most general, most salient kind of language variation. That there are French speakers, there are English speakers, there are speakers of the multiple Indian languages, multiple African languages, and we still thankfully have a lot of speakers of Native American languages left, even though they are endangered because of the prevalence of English here. There is also variation from dialect to dialect. Dialect variation is language variation according to groups of language users. So that's a very important kind of language variation. We here in East Texas tend to speak in an East Texas variety of Southern dialects. That's our dialect. If you grew up here, you at least, if that's not your dialect, then you hear it every day when you go shopping and so on. So that dialect variation is variation according to the users, groups of language users, and so we already covered this. Well, this is kind of like the same thing. That people speak different languages, English, Spanish, Russian, and so on, and people speak different dialects of their languages. Then we'll look at the third kind of variation in a minute. Now, what is the difference between a dialect and a language? Dialect is the umbrella term, and language is the umbrella term, and a language then has typically multiple dialects based on multiple groups of language users whose average of speaking features in their language varies from the average of another group of speakers. Like you can, let's think about this kind of a scenario where you are at a restaurant and you are waiting for your date or whoever you are having dinner with, and then you can't do anything else than just listen to the people behind you in the booth behind you, but you cannot see these people. So we can deduct, we can kind of infer a lot of things about the people, despite the fact that we don't see the people. So what are the kinds of things that you can know of a person without seeing a person, just by hearing the person speak, most obviously? Who they are, what kinds of features, like, is it a...
What was the question?
What?
What was the question?
So what can you infer if you don't see a person, you just hear a person speak? What kinds of things can you...
Their gender, normally.
Whether it's a...
Male or female?
Male or female, that's probably the most... Think about someone calling, one of those solicitors. That's probably the first thing you notice, that, oh, there's a man who called, there's a woman who called. And of course, gender is not necessarily binary, but we can. That's something that we can notice very, very easily. that it was a male or a female. We can also guess if that person was older or younger, right? We can also guess where the person comes from geographically. Is this a local person, you know, another person who lives in Huntsville, for instance? Or is it someone who calls from the Minnesota area in upper Midwest, or from New York, or so on. So we have these notions that how does a person speak if the person comes from a particular geographic area. You can also hear if a person has a foreign accent. First of all, I want to say everybody has an accent, so not only foreigners, everyone speaks in an accent, and everyone speaks in a dialect. Because in our speech, in our language, what is reflected is where we come from in terms of geography, in terms of social class, in terms of sometimes ethnicity, sometimes education background, and so on. So there are a lot of things we can guess about a person just by listening to how that person speaks. Now, this is not like it always happens, because people become, during their lives, if they are exposed to other dialects, or if there's a need for a person to, for instance, to acquire the standard dialect, which is the power dialect, but also keep in mind that the standard American English is also somebody's dialect. It's a dialect of, you know, typically of middle class white people, to be really like stereotypical. However, a lot of people become bidialectal when they go to college, for instance, because it's the prestige of the standard dialects. We cannot do much about it. We can, you know, talk the good game. Like linguists always emphasize that all varieties of language are created equal. All language varieties, like all dialects, all languages, they are linguistically equal. There's not a better or a worse variety of language, but we live what we could say a fallen world where not everybody is equal. Unfortunately, we're working towards that really, really hard, but it's a difficult journey to, and we have made a lot of progress, but then there are setbacks as well, and so on. But what linguists believe is that every single variety is capable of doing whatever the community of the speakers of that variety need to get done, and that's what is the value of every single variety. So dialects are different varieties of a particular language, and deciding what is a dialect versus what is a different language. If we compare two varieties, are they two different languages, or are they just two different dialects of the same language? That's a tough call sometimes, and that's why we say, linguists say that there are 5,000 to 7,000 languages in the world, because how to count what is a language as opposed to just the dialect of that language is not straightforward. If we think about it, most often it's the mutual intelligibility that is the criterion that people use to say, okay, that's a speaker of another language because I don't understand anything. But then we come into situations where we know that this person is speaking a variety of English, for instance, but we have trouble understanding this person because the dialect is so different from what our dialect, my dialect is, okay? And like for instance, think about Scottish English, for instance. If anyone has seen the cult movie, it's decades old now, but Train Spotting, are you familiar with that? So I think they use subtitles because it's so difficult to understand. It's not only Scottish English, but it's also working class Scottish English. So we're not exposed to that very often. So it's still English, but we have trouble following up. In Britain, very often when I was able to go there to see my daughter, it's when we go out to eat, I'm like, hey, can you order? Because I'm sometimes afraid of not understanding what the waiters say. They of course speak English, but if it is not the BBC English that I learned from school, I may have what did that person say? Especially if it's like a working class variety or a rural geographic variety, or combination of those, then I'm like, I'm not sure if I understood. So even though, I certainly understand English, but there are varieties of English that are harder to understand. You may have been yourselves in a situation where you know that a person is speaking English, but you have to really pay attention. The same thing happens also in all languages. There is one particular dialect in Finland, for instance, that it's a geographic dialect, and it's affected a lot by the contact with Swedish, and I have a hard time understanding it, or not really a hard time. If I see it written, that's fine, but when I listen to a person speak that dialect, I really have to pay a lot of attention. So that happens all over. So when do we start saying that, hey, I have so much trouble understanding this dialect that maybe it's a different language, we should call it a different language. Like if you think about British English and American English, you had that exercise that I gave to you about, trying to think what these British terms, what are they called in American English? And it's kind of, fun because lexical differences are kind of easy to grasp, but language differs, dialects differ from one another, not only lexically, but also phonologically, sometimes morphologically, sometimes even syntactically. And then, the more differences there are, the closer we are going to perhaps calling this dialect another language. But mutual intelligibility is usually the kind of like the rule of thumb. If we can understand most of what this person is saying, it must be speaking the same language as I. But that's not the case. Like, for instance, let's take Chinese as an example, and there are a lot of what the Chinese speakers call different Chinese dialects. For instance, Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese Chinese, spoken in different geographic areas in China, and these are called dialects, but a speaker of Mandarin doesn't understand a speaker of Cantonese, and vice versa, if they haven't studied that other dialect. So here we are in a situation where they are lumped under the umbrella of one language, Chinese, just being different dialects, but they are not mutually understandable. The reasons behind the Chinese deciding to call their different dialects just dialects and not different languages is that it brings unity to the political unit that we refer to as China, and also these different dialects, they share their cultural history. They also share the writing system. So that, interestingly, this is kind of fascinating. If a speaker of Cantonese doesn't know Mandarin and the Mandarin speaker doesn't know Cantonese, if they write down in Chinese characters what they are saying, the other person can read it. It just sounds totally different. So the Chinese characters are universally understood across the different Chinese dialects, but the spoken dialects are not. An opposite situation is found in Scandinavia, where we talk about different languages. We talk about Swedish, spoken in Sweden, Norwegian, spoken in Norway, Danish, spoken in Denmark. I'm going to leave Icelandic out of this because that is the language of the descendants of those people who moved from other parts of Scandinavia to Iceland during the Viking times, and their language, because it has been isolated from the other Scandinavian languages, has a lot of archaic features. So it resembles the language of the Vikings much more than the other Scandinavian languages. So it is harder to understand for all Scandinavians because it has those archaic features. But let's talk about Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. They are, to a large extent, mutually understandable, Norwegian and Swedish specifically, and yet the speakers of Norwegian and speakers of Swedish have decided to call them different languages and not just dialects of Scandinavian. And that is because, the state boundaries define which language is spoken, even though on the border between Sweden and Norway, the languages, the dialects start to resemble each other a lot more. The same thing happens in the geographic area of the Romance languages, Italic languages. Like, for instance, at the border of France and Italy, the closer you go to the border, the more the dialects of French and dialects of Italian resemble each other. That is referred to as a dialect continuum, that the further you go, the more different the dialects become, the closer you go to the meeting point, often a geographic boundary, a state boundary, the dialects become more similar, they have more similar features. So it increases the mutual intelligibility. But so in Scandinavia, the situation is such that people can pretty much understand each other, but they have decided to call them different dialects. So when we have a situation where we need to decide what is a language and what is just the dialect of a language, all kinds of considerations come into question. Mutual intelligibility is what linguists usually say. Okay, people can understand most of what the other person is saying, but it's ultimately the speakers of the dialects and languages who decide whether to call it just a dialect of a language or a different language. Okay. So, people speak different languages, people speak different dialects of their languages, and there's a third kind of important variation. Every speaker speaks a little bit differently depending on the situation of language use, and that is referred to as register variation. So, variation from situation to situation, and this is register variation. if you think about all the different kinds of situations that you find yourselves in during a day, and think about how that slightly changes the way you speak. We do it subconsciously, or we don't pay attention to it, but depending on who you are speaking to, you will speak a little bit differently. And that difference manifests itself in all the layers of language, the kinds of words you choose to use, the kinds of intonation patterns you choose to use, whether you use a lot of contractions, like I'm gonna do something, as opposed to I am going to do something. The situation, the formality of the situation or informality of the situation is this continuum that often explains part of the register variation. So if you just think about talking with your mother versus with your father versus with your sister or brother or a roommate or your teacher or custodians you meet here on the corridors, or if you go to Walmart, how do you speak to the person who checks you out? How do you speak to, if you go to church, how do you speak to the minister? How do you speak to your neighbors, your cousins, and so on? So that is one of the important features of the speech situation. The speech situation can vary in multiple ways. And participants is an important way that affect how we speak. So you choose your language a little bit differently. If you just if your best friend asks you, so what did you do over Thanksgiving break? Or if your mother asks you, if you weren't able to see her, so what did you do over Thanksgiving break? Your answer will be different. Perhaps content-wise, but also language-wise, how you speak to a different person. So participants is an important factor of the speech situation. Also the topic that you're talking about. You will talk differently about linguistics than you talk about movies, for instance, also the setting of the situation where we are defines to an extent how you speak. When we are in this setting that I'm talking to you, my students are sitting there in the auditorium, I'm standing here, I speak very differently than the way I speak when I go home and start speaking with my husband, or when my daughters call and I speak to them. But the setting, so that's participants that make a difference to the register of how we speak. But also, if we imagine just us here, here I'm using my lecture voice, right? But when I speak to you, when you're sitting there on the benches in the hall, I don't use my lecture voice when I speak to you, even though these are the same participants. But just the setting defines how I speak, and it also defines how you speak back to me. Here, if I ask a question, you first of all you speak less here. If I see you somewhere on campus or the hallway, you tend to speak more. You even initiate some topics, and then we walk in here and I hog the conversational floor because the setting defines that. So there are multiple different things that define registers and how we speak differently in different situations. So 3 different kinds of language variation, from language to language, from dialect to dialect, and from register to register, and that's the situational variation. So if dialect variation is variation according to groups of language users, register variation is variation according to situations of language use. So everybody speaks some language, everybody speaks some dialect of that language, but all of us vary slightly, sometimes not so slightly, in how we speak depending on the situation of language use. And obviously, the more a person needs to be in different kinds of situations, the more registers that person tends to have. I, for instance, have very rarely had to take my car to the shop and speak with the mechanics. And I can't do it very well. So I always try to resort, and this sounds horrendously like old-fashioned. I always try to wangle my way so that my husband takes my car, because he can talk the register with the car mechanics. And I have too many strikes against me. I'm a woman, I'm a foreigner, and even my car is not what they are used to fixing. So the mechanic specifically said, do not buy a Volvo, because they're so hard to fix. And so there are so many kind of like strikes against me that, and I don't know a terminology. If I have some kind of a weird noise coming from the engine compartment, not department, I don't know how to describe it. The same thing if you go to a doctor, to a dentist, and they have all this terminology that we don't even understand about for every single tooth, and I'm just like, my front tooth is hurting, and they have the term for it, like, you know, it's some kind of a number. I never bothered to learn it. So we are speaking different registers, and you go to a doctor, you're trying to, you say, I have this pain on my side, and you don't know the words, they know the words, and so it's difficult to explain something because we lack the register. Another thing is the specific register is required when you are at a cocktail party. So you're supposed to be holding your glass and walking from one group of people to another group of people and making small talk. And that is a skill that is difficult to do if you are not exposed to those kinds of situations. So the more situations a person is exposed to, the more registers they pick up. And you're taking courses at college in different topics, in different subjects. It exposes you to those special registers that are used in those different topics, so you become capable of talking about a particular topic, and so on. Okay, any questions about that? So everybody is capable of varying the way they speak depending on the situation, but you know, if a person's life is very restricted, they don't have a lot of situational demands to use different kinds of registers, and then their language is more, they use fewer registers. So the more situations you are exposed to, the more registers you will acquire. I also have trouble like speaking to small children in English, not in Finnish, but in English, because I never, were around enough small children, English-speaking children. So that's another register that, I could develop skills for. Okay, so language variation, we have different languages, different dialects, different registers. This is, by the way, on the blackboard also, so you don't need to copy these. And what is an idiolect then? An idiolect is the way a particular person speaks. Everybody speaks a little bit differently, and that's how we are able to recognize, when your friend calls, you've got multiple friends, a friend calls and you can figure out, okay, that's Mark, or that's someone else. And it's because people also speak idiosyncratically in different ways from other people. So those are called idiolects. It's the way one person speaks. Then we also have what are referred to as family-lects. They are, there may be some lexical items that no other family uses except your family. So there may be something that, you may have said when you were little, a child language acquisition thing, and that kind of stuck as part of the family lect. That is the term then used, like for pillow. A family may be calling pillows pios, because that's, where's your pio, where's your binky, because that's how the grown children used to call those objects. Accents, keep that as a separate term. It refers to phonological features of a dialect. So a particular, like for instance, Southern accent, it refers to the phonological features of Southern English. So not only foreigners have dialects, everybody has a dialect, and everybody has an accent as well, because everybody speaks using certain phonological features of that dialect. So everybody speaks with an accent. Slang, what is slang? Slang is the stylistic choices, like when you are giving an academic paper, you're not using the informal terms. Slang terms are used very often with good friends in informal situations. Jargon is the use of vocabulary related to a profession, like computerese and legalese and car mechanizes or mechanese or doctorese and so on. So language versus dialect, we already talked about that. The Chinese case, the Scandinavian case, and the important thing is that ultimately the speakers decide what is a language and what is just the dialect of that language. Dialect versus register. Register is pretty much the same as style. So all people speak in a dialect, just to wrap this up. With our dialect, we send a message of our group affiliations, and all people alter their speech depending on the speech situation. So register and style variations, language variation, according to the situations of language use. Then we have dialect variation according to the groups of language users, regional geographic variation, socioeconomic variation, gender variation, age variation, and ethnic variation. So your ethnicity does not predict how you speak, but we can sometimes detect a person's ethnicity because of the dialect, and socioeconomic variation often is mistaken for ethnic variation. So, and also keep in mind that, like for instance, African American vernacular English is a dialect of English, but you don't have to be African American in order to use that particular variety. And that particular variety shares a lot of features with other non-standard varieties of English. Okay, let's finish there. And about the final, you've got the list of topics, and and send me an email if you have any questions while you study for it. And thank you for the semester. It's been lovely to be working with you. Thank you.